Kitty, get out of there. Come on. You want you in my comics. Psst, psst, psst. Come on. Oh no. No, no, no. Oh, okay. Please. No. What a bad kitty. What a terrible kitty. Okay, bye, kitty.
Cat Scratch Fever may be the episode that most differentiates this version of Catwoman from the traditional comic book take. To my recollection, this is the only story in the series where Catwoman doesn't commit a single morally questionable action, at least by Batman standards. Breaking into Daggett's lab to save her cat Isis is nothing Batman wouldn't do. In the comics, Catwoman of course has an affinity for her namesake, but the animated series version goes as far as to actively be for animal rights. It's interesting then that Cat Scratch Fever is by far my least favorite of Catwoman's episodes. I personally have always been a fan of the interplay between Batman and Catwoman, and this version plays no small part in why I like the two of them together as much as I do. It's smart that the very first time we see her in this series, she's up to exactly the sort of things we always see Catwoman doing, executing a heist. There's nothing like that in this episode, which means there's no real friction between Catwoman and Batman that makes sparks fly. There is potential for some good conflict when the episode immediately establishes that Selina Kyle cannot be Catwoman lest she wind up back in jail, and there's even a scene to support this possible tension when Bruce Wayne advises her that her probation could be revoked, but there's no real payoff to it, at least in this episode. Cat Scratch Fever merely sets up this status quo for Selina Kyle, but it's the later episode Catwalk that actually does anything with it. This adds to the general sense that Cat Scratch Fever is very inconsequential. That's not to say I can't enjoy a quote-unquote filler episode, if there even is such a thing in Batman the Animated Series, where there are no ongoing story arcs beyond two-parters. All I'm saying is that I don't need an episode to dramatically shake things up for me to enjoy it. A lot of the time, characters simply doing what they're good at is enough for me. It's partly why I enjoy a show like House, despite many episodes having the same conflict type. Most every episode of that show gives me good moments of characterization that makes the familiar plots a lot more tolerable. Cat Scratch Fever doesn't give me any new moments of fun with either Batman or Catwoman where I get to understand them a little better. They're just going through the motions. Catwoman loves her cat Isis, so she tries to stop Daggett's ludicrous scheme of infecting Gotham strays with a virus. Batman is the good guy of the show, so he also tries to stop Daggett. There's not really anything more to it than that. Yes, the episode tries to generate suspense through a ticking clock of infecting Selina with the virus, but it's never enough to make me believe even for a moment that she may not make it. A big, unforgivable mistake the episode makes is that it essentially writes Catwoman out of the story once she's infected, even though the first half makes the audience follow her like she's the protagonist of the episode. Batman intrudes on her story and handles pretty much all of the work that would have made for a compelling series of trials for Catwoman. It would have gone a long way to making me feel like she's in serious danger of dying if she was more proactive and still trying to get Daggett even as the virus is getting worse. Instead, she's left inside some nondescript building to look on while Batman tangles with some goons. And a dog. This is especially problematic because all the personal stakes are with Selina. It's not brilliant or anything, but the Cat in the Claw two-parter does a good job of establishing that Selina cares deeply for Isis in a way that's extremely relatable, especially for us pet owners. Which reminds me, Selina's confidant Maven kinda gets thrown under the bus by failing to keep an eye on Isis. I get that the idea is that Isis misses Selina so much she goes off on her own, out of that deep connection, but Maven has to know how much Selina cares for her cat and how distraught she'd be if anything happened to Isis. Then again, unlike dogs, cats pretty much just do whatever they want, and there's not much one can do to stop them. All I'm saying is that I expected Maven to be a bit more competent based on the last time we saw her. Anyway, I appreciate that Batman recognizes this bond, and the fact that he saves Isis again, he already did so in the aforementioned heist scene in Catwoman's first appearance, shows a compassionate side to him, which I'm always thankful for, so as to not make Batman too cold. Still, the story immediately becomes less engaging because Batman himself doesn't have that bond Selina does. He does care deeply for Selina, but other than that moment of compassion at the end, Batman has no real stake in the story. As a result, the episode starts to feel very plot oriented instead of story oriented, and the over the top thugs end up being the most memorable aspect of the whole thing. Especially that lady. She really loves shooting everything. Batman the Animated Series is remembered for being very dark, serious, and atmospheric, and while there are tons of episodes that exemplify that, and the show as a whole is definitely plenty more serious than cartoons from the 80s, episodes like this one show that Batman the Animated Series still has some cartoony sensibilities. Batman himself is a bit more talkative than I'm accustomed to in this series, especially the scene where he's interrogating a thug strung upside down. That is probably more because Batman the Animated Series is in large part heavily influenced by 70s Batman comics, where he was more verbose than depicted as in modern comics. I think once we reached Superman the Animated Series, Bruce Timm and the other producers of the main DC animated universe found a more consistent tone that ended up being a bit more serious, while still not taking itself too seriously, leaving room for crazy comic book-esque storylines and effective levity. While gone will be the days of two-dimensional cartoon thugs, I think, this episode introduces us to Professor Milo, who will indeed return all the way later in Justice League Unlimited. It wasn't until I saw JLU that I even realized that Milo was a comic book character. His appearance here is still within the constructs of a more grounded crime world Batman inhabits, but his next appearance in Moon of the Wolf points the way to his more science fiction mad scientist exploits. By the way, just letting you guys know that whenever I mention other episodes of DC Animated Universe series, it's a good sign that I'm running out of things to say. Moving along to the animation quality, like last time, it's on the lower tier. This was animated by Acom Production Co., which was responsible for several other episodes we've covered, like Feet of Clay Part 1, Be a Clown, and The Cat and the Claw Part 2. Christmas with the Joker is probably their best looking one, at least to my memory, but I'm not a fan of how bulgy and round the characters seem under them. There are moments where they keep some of the more angular features that adheres closer to Bruce Timm's style, but Batman especially looks too big and lacking some muscle definition. The highlights of the episode are how the dog moves and Machine Gun Lady shooting the ice when Batman grabs her leg. That one is an example of particularly good storyboarding with the use of an overhead shot. My least favorite aspect of the visuals is, strangely enough, Selina's eyes. In almost every shot, they are solid green circles, and without a distinct pupil, it makes all her expressions seem very lifeless. This stinks because the episode calls for Selina being more vulnerable than we often see her, and she just can't emote. Another small detail that bothers me, though not as much as Selina's eyes, is that I notice a lot of awkward hand acting in this one. That may be more of an issue with the storyboard than the animation itself, but I think keeping an eye out for every time someone points could make for a pretty good drinking game. According to the DCAU wiki, it was their low-quality work on this very episode that led Bruce Timm to drop ACOM. We have another snow episode here, so the backgrounds look suitably lovely. Even more unusual is that a lot of the action doesn't take place in the urban parts of Gotham. It's a bit refreshing to see Batman run around some icy woods. The frozen lake could potentially look bland, but the artistry on the backgrounds is always on point. It ends up being my favorite location in the episode. In terms of voice acting, there really isn't anyone new to speak of except for Treat Williams as Milo. He's okay, nothing all that memorable, which is nothing against Williams. Milo isn't an especially interesting character until we see him in JLU, and by then he's got a different voice actor. He's voiced by Armin Shimmerman in JLU, by the way, who some geeks may recognize as Quark in Star Trek DS9, or Principal Snyder in Buffy. Ed Asner returns as Daggett, and he does a good job as always, but again, there's nothing interesting going on with him. In fact, Daggett's plan is extremely out there for a guy in a business suit type villain. He wants to poison the entire city with a lethal virus to which he'll provide the cure for. That's huge in scale and would definitely not go unnoticed by authorities and especially Batman. I mean, to be fair, his company did produce a makeup formula with nasty enough side effects to create Clayface, and he's even got toxic-looking vats of the stuff. But I could at least see that as something he could easily avoid consequences for through lawsuits and denial. There's also the fact that Matt Hagen only turned to Clayface because he was exposed to a huge amount of the formula, so that probably wouldn't have been a problem for the general public. Anyway, this episode has only one real saving grace, and that is Adrienne Barbeau returning as Catwoman. I've already praised her performance, and she's not even the definitive Catwoman voice in my head. That honor belongs to Grey DeLisle, but my god, is Barbeau a close second. Then again, Gina Gershon also did a tremendous job in The Batman. Guess Catwoman has been blessed with consistently great portrayals. But anyway, back to Barbeau. What I like about her specifically in this episode is that she brings an enormous amount of conviction to the character while being able to switch to a more laid back, alluring tone with such ease. Perhaps the best example of this is the scene where Selina tangles with the two thugs in the alley. While she's dealing with them, Barbeau gives the voice an intimidating strength, but the second Batman shows up, she turns back to the sexy femme fatale with the line, "Don't tell me you're my very own probation officer. How often would you like me to check in?" And that doesn't in any way betray Selina's determination in the task at hand. Barbeau is great at conveying that there's something attractive about Batman that brings out a more playful side out of her. Speaking of playful, the music this time didn't stand out much to me, but it does bring back Catwoman's theme, which perfectly embodies the character. It may be in my top 3 of my favorite music from this show, and is the music that springs foremost to my mind whenever I think of Catwoman, even more than some of the Danny Elfman music from Batman Returns. But yeah, I think that does it for Cat Scratch Fever. It's mildly entertaining, some decent moments, but nothing really good or memorable. Fortunately, Catwoman's here, and though she gets pushed to the side, it's always a pleasure to see her in Batman the Animated Series. I give it a 3 out of 5. After these last two, I think we're finally going to get a slightly more fun episode next time around with The Strange Secret of Bruce Wayne. Until then, hope you guys take care. Now excuse me while I go and read Rooftops from Tom King's run for the millionth time. See you guys.